Hi, this is James LoMenzo, and I'm here to say hello on behalf of myself and Ashdown Amplifiers. Throughout my career, I've spent a lot of time trying to find the perfect bass sound, and that required a lot of thought and experimentation and searching. One of the things I found was it's not just in the bass guitar. The bass amplifier is probably equally as important as the instrument that you play, especially for the kind of music that I like, the older music, the stuff that came up in the 60s and 70s. It seemed like a lot of bass players at that time were developing these amazing tones, and these are the things that really drew my attention. I loved Chris Squire and Stanley Clarke and people like John Entwistle, who had these very extraordinary tones. They sounded like a bridge between a guitar and a bass and a rhythm section all in one instrument. I always really liked to try and identify an instrument, whether I was sure of what it was or not. I was always delighted to find out that that contributing sound to the great song was the sound of the bass guitar. For instance, the song Roundabout. If you listen to that, I thought it was a clavinet or something like that, even though I didn't know what a clavinet was at the time. But looking back at it, it had that really interesting timbre to it. I remember thinking to myself after I found out it was a bass guitar, I was like, what guitar do you need? How do you do that? There's so many elements that contribute to that. Eventually it came to the point of realizing and learning that a big part of that sound was the amplification used. You'd find that a guy like Chris Squire was using two amplifiers. He'd use a guitar amplifier and a bass amplifier and bring them together. At the time, that would be a Marshall 412 with a 100-watt head and maybe a Fender 50 or 100-watt, all tubes. And he'd split the pickups out and get that sound from the treble pickup and from the middle pickup, the pickup closest to the neck. So these sounds always really intrigued me. I started out in the 70s as a bass player. As a young man, I started playing guitar. Prior to that, I was playing drums, and I loved drums. My parents had bought me a snare drum to learn how to play music, and I practiced rudiments on that daily. And as Christmas rolled around, I remember my dad in particular said, "Wouldn't you like to play a guitar?" And I thought, guitar would be great. What I didn't realize was he was probably trying to get the racket out of the house and get me to start playing something that they could tolerate a little more. But either way, there was a shiny red guitar under the Christmas tree, and I unwrapped it, and I was excited because now I was able to kind of strum along and sing songs that I loved that were on the radio at the time. So this was a huge growth spurt for me musically, because now I was self-contained. I could actually perform. I could sing, and I can play guitar, and I could entertain people. And the quicker I got these songs together, the more I would gather people around me to listen. And as a young guy, I mean, that's intoxicating. So I loved that. Up until the age of 10 or 11 years old, I think that's what I did. I played guitar, and I remember bringing an acoustic guitar to my public school. And the teacher was like, "Well, what's that for?" And I said, "Well, I thought I'd play a song for the class." And so she said, "Oh yes, by all means, get up and play a song." So I played something that was on the radio at the time. Might have been a Creedence Clearwater Revival song, I don't know, whatever they were playing on the radio. And I sat there and I strummed, and the teacher said to me, she goes, "That was lovely. Why don't you take your guitar and go to the other classes and do that for them?" And I thought to myself, wow, this is amazing. I'm not going to sit here and learn basic math and all that stuff. I'm just going to take my guitar and basically play hooky in school. So I took that guitar to all the classes, and I played for the kids, and people were enthralled, and that was really exciting to me because I felt like I was communicating on some level, and so I was hooked. I became a musician at that age. Later on that year, my junior high school teacher had started a summer camp, which was a music and arts summer camp. So you could be in an orchestra, or you could do plays, or even a rock band. So my plan was to get up there and bring my guitar and perhaps create a rock band. So I thought to myself, all right, well, that's what I'll do this summer. So I went to that camp, and I brought my guitar, and at the time I was playing French horn as well. So I was going to join the orchestra. And my first day out there, I was in a boat, and I went out on the lake just to check it out, and all of a sudden I heard this sound coming from across the camp. and it was like this low billowing boom, boom, and I was like, what is that? So I wrote in as quickly as I can, and then I went to the rehearsal place, and there was a fella kicked back in the little rehearsal room with an EBO bass, and he was just thunking out notes. And I said to him, well, that's a bass guitar, right? And he goes, yeah, sure, I brought it with me. And he goes, you want to try it? So I was excited. So I picked the thing up and I started playing on it, and I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever played, because it served two functions to me. First of all, it brought me back to my initial draw to music, rhythm. I wanted to be a drummer. So I realized this is a percussive instrument for the most part. And then it seemed to bridge the gap between guitar and drums, because you could make arpeggios and break up chords and kind of insinuate what the sound of the song you were playing was. So anyway, to my surprise, the fellow said to me, he goes, you know, you can use that this summer. I just brought it up to fool around with. And I was like, really? Do you mind if I? And he said, sure, go ahead, have that. And so I held on to that bass guitar, and I started a rock band as a singing bass guitar player, and put that band together. And we played everything that was on the radio that summer. And you know, Jumping Jack Flash by the Rolling Stones was a song that was in my repertoire. You know, there was all these great songs. Down on the Corner, Creedence Clearwater Revival, all this Americana rock and English rock. And we put together a band, and I found a drummer, and I found another guitar player, and I found another singer. And we ended up playing like at the camp, and also there was a pizza parlor, which by night was by the afternoon was a strip club. Young ladies, you know, entertaining gentlemen. And at night they would just have entertainment, and that was us. So we tried to get there early, but we usually missed out. Anyway, and so as soon as I got home later on that summer, I began to chart my course to become a bass player. And what that was immediately was I took the two high strings off of my 6-string electric guitar and turned the tone all the way down on my Lafayette amp, and played with my fingers, and just kind of aped what I was doing all summer until I could put together enough money to buy my own bass guitar. Later on, back in Brooklyn, I put together a band of some local friends. One of them was Steve O'Geary, who ended up singing in Journey for many years. He was my guitar player, and I was playing bass, and we got a fellow named Angelo Mancini and Leo Portugsi on the drums, and we called ourselves Sardonicus. And we went on to continue what I was doing up at the summer camp, and that is to start playing music. And now it was time for James to buy a bass amp. And so there was only one music store in my neighborhood, and they had the most ridiculous Fender amplifier I'd ever seen. It was a 100-watt Fender, well, it was a Fender 100 is what they called it, and it was all tubes, and it had this ridiculous square speaker box with 4 12-inch speakers, but they were all on separate panels. So it made this really ridiculous sound, kind of really nasal, and it didn't really have a lot of low end. It didn't sound like the records I was trying to emulate. And so as I played block parties that summer with the band, I kept turning the amp up just to fill the space in the streets. And I noticed that it was just all nasty sounding. It didn't sound anything like the records that I was trying to emulate. So this started me on my quest of trying to find a sound, a bass guitar sound that was preponderant, powerful, and articulate, that had a personality. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it. I didn't have a lot of money at the time. I had already invested in this ridiculous amplifier, and so it began. Moving forward into the clubs, I started to make a little bit of money. I worked on construction with my dad, and so I put away some money and started buying amplifiers, whatever was out there. And there were some really good ones. PV made some amplifiers, you know, all these manufacturers made pretty decent amps, but I could never quite get enough power. So as my journey moved along, I started noticing a lot of the players that were coming through the rock clubs in the late 70s, early 80s had these independent multiple amplifiers. They'd have a preamplifier, and then they'd have a power amp. The power amps of the day were BGWs and Crowns. And I thought to myself, that's what I have to do. So I just started saving as much money as I could to put together those kind of systems. And the trick was always finding the right preamp. And so what I had eventually settled on, and this came about when I was in the band White Lion in the 80s, was a Pierce BC1, which is what Billy Sheehan was using. I'd seen him in the clubs many times and was really impressed by his sound. And what it turned out to be was I had this hybrid, well, it wasn't a hybrid, it was actually a transistor amplifier into a big transistor power amp. So those BC1s had an emulation circuit before they called them that. It was actually just this FET that really broke up really nicely. Sounded a lot like the Marshall breakup. So I used that into a Crown power amplifier, and at the time I think the amps were maybe, I don't know, maybe 250 watts per side, so that was a good solid 500 watts. So I had settled on this tone throughout all the White Lion stuff, and actually locked into the sound I was looking for. At the time I had SVT cabinets, which were really kind of wobbly and rolly. They sounded good to the guys in the band because they could hear the low end spreading everywhere, but to my ear, I didn't like them. They didn't focus very well. Again, didn't sound like that stuff that I was chasing, that I was listening to on the radio and on the record. Moving ahead, I started really trying to figure out exactly what I was going to do as far as putting together amplification that would really satisfy me. Shoot forward to the 2000s. Just before that, I was playing with Zakk Wylde, and I noticed everybody was playing Trace Elliot. Trace Elliot amps were the new kid on the block. I mean, if you saw Mark King, he had them on stage, and he had a really slappy, articulate tone that you can really pick out every note and every attack. And I thought those were really cool. Well, I met a representative for Trace Elliot at the time, just as I was finishing up with White Lion. And later on, he had turned me on to this 810 cabinet that they had created. And that 810 cabinet was fantastic because it actually was two 410 cabinets built into one big box, and they were separated, so they didn't interact. The cool thing about them, though, was that they were both ported. They provided these stoppers to put in the ports so that you could make it act like a pressurized cabinet, which meant that the low frequency portion of the cabinet would come up. It wouldn't roll it quite as low. And you could leave two of the ports open, which meant it acted like a bigger cabinet because the subs would come out of those holes and you'd be able to hear more of that and less of the punch. The two in one box really worked for me very well because it finally gave me that sense of immediacy. The same thing the guitar players had, because the 412 cabinets are like that. They're not ported, they're just reflex cabinets is what they're called, so they're pressurized. So the speaker kind of fights against the air in the cabinet and just stops in a certain place. So I had that kind of guitar tone finally on the top of that, and then I had that rolling low frequency. And that set me on the course of what I was actually looking for. So the year is 2000, I joined David Lee Roth's band. Okay, I have a bunch of money in my pocket, ready to go. We're about to go on this huge tour. And so I start looking around at the NAMM show, and I noticed these Ashdown amplifiers. I had only heard of them because John Entwistle was using them. I'd been following his career forever, so I always felt like the guy at the bar saying, well, I'll have whatever he's having. He always had a great tone, and he was a real innovator. And so I met the representative from Ashdown after that not too long ago. And I asked him, so how, do you do artist endorsements? And they were like, well, Ashdown doesn't necessarily do artist endorsements. I mean, we will take you into there and, use your name for using our products. We'll give you a discount, but you're going to have to buy the gear. And that didn't bother me in the least. I was going to buy it anyway. So I picked up one of their ABM 500s, which was a preamp and an amplifier. And I was concerned because I went, only 500 watts? I mean, don't you think I'll need more? I picked up their 810 cabinets, which were completely pressurized cabinets, but very deep ones, and made out of some really heavy wood. So I went to go play those before I picked them up at the distributors. And I was immediately impressed by the focus, low frequency, and the amount of push that they had. Not just the cabinets, but the preamp too. The preamp had a lot of flexibility. You could get a really good subby sound. You can get a really good, that Chris Squire-y sound that I like really get that top end of the string and still have enough bottom to it. So I bought the stuff immediately and I brought it to rehearsal, and at that time I think I only had one 810 and that 500 watt ABM, and I stuck it up there and played along with Ray Luzier, who was playing drums at rehearsal. and it just filled the room. And I was astounded because the thing just, I go near it and I can kind of smell it heating up because it was really doing a lot of work, but the thing just never backed down. It just seemed like it had even more headroom. The louder I play, the harder I play, the more the sound would come up. I was just snookered. I couldn't believe what was coming out of this very simple setup. So anyway, I called up the company and I said, look, I'm your man. Let's get some amps going. So immediately I went and I purchased a bunch of those power amps they had at the time, which were the PM1000s. The PM1000s were fantastic because they were 500 watts on either side. So it was a 1,000-watt power amp, and I bought 2 of those right off the bat. And what I loved about those were, it kind of brought me into the power range I had when I used to play in the 80s. I had a Crown power amp, which was about 1,200 watts. So it was in that neighborhood. So this was something, I was used to this much power going into the speaker cabinets. So I set up that system and I took off on the road. We played the Sam and Dave tour. And I was just flabbergasted by the whole thing. I loved it. And so not too long after that, I joined with Black Label Society. And I came up with this kooky, crazy, super deluxe setup. I thought, let's see, the sound I really used to love was something I did in Pride and Glory, which was that old BC1 preamp that I told you about. They don't make them anymore. The company went out of business years and years ago, but I still had a few of them laying around. So what I did was I decided to incorporate that with my ABM setup. And the cool thing about the ABM setup is that you've got an input in the back which will mix just about anything you want into the system. So it'll go directly to the power amp output, right behind the master volume. So you can mix that right along with the front end of the Ashdown as it is. So now I had 2 of my favorite great sounds. I had this gnarly growling thing going into the back of the ABM, and the great sound of the ABM itself, that big, wide, chesty, articulate, punchy, slightly distorted sound. And between the 2 of those and the power amps I had, let me see, I think I added to that too. I bought a couple of, I had Ashdown make me a couple of custom 215 boxes. I still have those, by the way, to get that low end. So these are ported boxes. And then I had 4 A10s, which I put all around there, and absolutely everything was on. I added one more PM1000 to those. And that amplifier was just terrifying. There isn't a Marshall on earth that can keep up with that thing. And that was the plan. So that was my biggest, most profound Ashdown setup. Take a look at it. I'll put it up there on the screen. So as I mentioned, in 2001, I picked up my first Ashdown rig and was just blown away by it, and took that from band to band and expanded, made it bigger, made it smaller. But anyway, I was hooked on the company's amplifiers. I just think they're exactly what I was looking for. And to this day, I actually feel that if I'm not playing through the Ashdown amp, I don't feel like I can really communicate the sound that's in my head. So I've been on these amplifiers since the early 2000s, right up until today. I've played every Ashdown imaginable. I played the CTMs, I played the Little Bastard, the 427 Big Block, which is the most terrifying amplifier that Ashdown ever made. That's 400 and God knows how many watts of who knows what. I remember playing that one at a NAMM show one time, and a friend of mine slipped off into the bathroom as he had to go, and he told me it was just rattling the place, and the bathroom had to be about 80 feet away from where I was playing. So anyway, so the police didn't get me that time. I'd also played the Mark King models, which I love. It's actually, Ashdown's got so many different designs, but they all do something different. The tube amp range is round, but modern, but old school. You just push the right buttons and you can kind of dial in all those things. I've been using that with John Fogerty, the CTM 300 into an ABM A10. Oh, I've been using that for over 10 years now on stage, and that's a great sound. If you're going to play an old school thing and you need one amplifier, the CTM 300 is fantastic. The 100 does the same job, just without as much air movement. John likes it loud, and so do I, so the 300 suited us both just fine. I'm back to the ABMs though. There's been some changes over the years to the ABMs, and I actually love them, but my old stuff just sounded great and familiar, so I just kept using my old stuff. I'd go to the trade shows and play with the new ones with the added EQ and the compression and all that, but I never really got to take any of that on stage because I just kept playing my old stuff. This year with Megadeth, it was time for me to re-up a lot of my amplification because I've been carrying this stuff around with me for over 20 years now. So I asked Dan, I said, well, what do you recommend? I just like the ABM thing. And he goes, well, we've got the new 600s, and I think they'd suit you really well. There's just a little more power. We have the dual VU, so you can see what's going on the output side, which they've never had before. And they've got the compressor built in there, and they've got a different kind of an input stage, so it winds up into the tube a little hotter. And so I was like, send me one out and let's see let's see how it sings. And so we did that, and I was just blown away. At the NAMM show back in 2000, I met Mark Godet, the designer of these wonderful amplifiers, and I immediately took to him. He's a kindred spirit. He's a great designer, and he really understands how to design an amplifier for the bass guitar player. I realized that right away. I mean, the proof of the pudding is in his amplifiers, but if you spend a little bit of time with him, you can tell that he's obsessive, which is a good thing for a designer, but he's also passionate. And those two elements coming together make for just a great guy. He's been keeping this company afloat for years, and basically it's a mom and pop operation. It's rough out there, and in order to service the world with these kind of amplifiers, it takes a really special kind of person, somebody very strong-willed, and somebody very brave. The stuff that he made, I call him an ampsmith. The initial designs that he came up with are still tried and true, and there's a little bit of that in every new model that they make. And there's a line of consistency that I really love, because I always, I know that if I get the new Ashdown amplifier, it's going to be something that I can really use, but also something that I'm familiar with, just familiar enough with so that I can quickly get on with it. And I also know it's going to last. I've had some of these amplifiers that have fallen off the trucks that are still going 20 years. They're all bent out of shape, but but they're still singing. And that's like, as much as they sound great, if they don't last, they're useless. So that's really important, especially somebody like me who just has to keep putting his stuff on a truck and meeting up with it later on, and just hoping for the best. It's very important to have really well-made equipment that you can count on. Flexible, the stuff is flexible. There's more in and outs in these things. There's more ways to put them together, to incorporate other gear that you have. That's something that I've always been really fond of, because I tend to like to experiment a lot. And so, a lot of people go, oh, it's the amplifier, just plug in and leave it flat. And, I can't do that, man. There's always somewhere else to go with equipment. And so to have the opportunity to have outputs and loops and all that stuff. Some of the early preamps that I use the RPM1, I think that's what it was. There was a John Entwistle model. That was fabulous. There was a built-in crossover in that one. And that, if you really want to turn people blue, use that with an 18-inch folded horn, and just put the low frequency out of one amplifier from that, and that's a good way to do it. Innovation, familiarity, and just built rock solid. Those are the Ashdown strengths, man. That's why I keep going back, and that's why you can't sell me on another amplifier. And God knows people have tried. So anyway, my hat's off to Mark and Dan and everybody over at Ashdown, and I thank you for looking out for me all these years and actually giving me the best sound I've ever had on any stage and every stage. The ABMs, of course, are still my generic favorite. I can pick up one of those and do a gig anywhere in the world, anytime, and I can dial it as quick as you can say, have you dialed that amp yet? I just did. They're as loud as you need them to be, even on the small side. Even like if there's the 400 watt one is enough. I don't think I've ever pushed these to their limit. They have enough output and headroom, especially through the ABM A10s, where you don't really need to do a lot to them. You know, if you use a lot of low end, then I definitely suggest, I mean a lot of low end, if you crank that first bass knob all the way up, then I probably suggest using a couple of them, or the 1200, you know, and get as much power as you can. This way you can really flood the stage. But even with all that, you won't burn out those speakers. First tour I did with Megadeth, I took 4 810s with me and a couple of 215s. And so for good measure, I carried a bunch of those Blue Line speakers, the Ashdown Blue Line speakers. It was in cartons just in case they burned out, and you know I've never had to replace one, ever. They're still cranking away. I've got some of the old cabinets in my garage, and those things are still singing. Reliability is crazy with these things. You just can't break an Ashdown cabinet, and I've tried. At the end of a lot of the Black Label shows, I would topple some of the cabinets just for effect. It's having a little too much to drink and too much fun. But I would topple those things just for effect, just to watch people freak out, and the things would just pow, hit the floor. And I'm telling you, I still have them, and they still sound great. So, sorry, Mark, didn't mean to abuse your stuff. You know, it's all in the spirit of rock and roll. You know that. Using the ABMs, you can get a very, very reputable Who John Entwistle tone. I have no problem doing that. If I couple my Ashdown Hyperdrive at the front end of the ABM, I can nail the Entwistle tone. And that, my friends, is worth the price of admission. If you like that sound, that old sound, this is the place to go, man. Pick up one of these amplifiers. James LoMenzo Hyperdrive, I developed that with Ashdown back in the 2000s, mid-2000s. I was looking for a drive for bass guitar that wouldn't screw around with the actual sound of the bass guitar, but would enhance just a certain range, a small range of the bass, so that you could just really latch on to a certain frequency range and just have that distort, and then mix that with your bass guitar and have that so you could play along and still have all those rich harmonics come out. I think that gives the bass a three-dimensional kind of a feel when you're playing it. So the designers over at Ashdown, you know, I drew a circuit out, a very crude one, but it was basically what I was looking for. And they implemented it perfectly. I was shocked. They sent me the pedal, and not only did it look great, but it did everything I wanted to. And it's been that kind of a pedal where I could bring it with me anywhere, and if, God forbid, I show up and there's no Ashdown because they didn't rent one or something like that, I could put this in front of that amplifier and still get that character that I'm always looking for. And so that sold out in years. That was done. People bought that thing in droves, and I'm very happy and proud of that. Going forward, we're actually talking about a new one. I can't tell you right now what it is, but it's coming, kids, and it's pretty exciting. So keep an eye out for that. And I just want to say thank you very much for giving me a little of your time, and have a great time here tonight. And I hope to see you out there on the road with Megadeth this year. So this year I've been running around with Megadeth, actually last year too. In 2007, after I was finished with Black Label Society, I got a call from a friend, and he said to me, are you interested in joining another band? And at that moment I really wasn't, but he said, you know, it's one of the big four. And the big four what? And he goes, big four metal bands. So I thought to myself really quickly, and I said, well, it can't be Metallica, because Robert Trujillo is doing that. And I said, well, it's Megadeth, isn't it? And he said, well, I can't tell you, I've been sworn to secrecy, but send me a demo and I'll send it off. And I said, you'll send it off to Dave Mustaine, won't you? And he goes, I can't tell you, just get it together. So I put together my a CD of things, and I didn't have a lot of metal stuff. Actually, I hadn't played a lot of thrash metal in my life, but I had one thing that I had recorded with Ray Luzier and Toshi Hiketa from David Lee Roth's band. We had a band called the Hideous Sun Demons, which was kind of this jazz fusion rock instrumental thing that we put together, and it was called The Mummy. And I remember having recorded that on a 6-string bass, which is unusual for me, which gave me a lot of top-end runs and some really low, scary stuff on the bottom. And I used that whole fretboard to do that. And so I thought this is pretty preponderant, at least whoever listens to it will notice. And sure enough, I get a call the next day, and it was Dave Mustaine. And I said, well, did you listen to my CD? And he goes, I listened to everything. And I said, well, he goes, I think you're a great bass player. I would love for you to come down and let's do an audition. Come on down. And so I packed up my car with a 412 box, which is a Trace Elliott one, by the way, probably designed by Mark. I don't know. You tell me about that, Mark. And a head, my ABM head, and what else did I have? A pedal board. And my big buzzard bass, one of those big black ones that I was playing in Black Label Society, the Warwick Buzzard. And so I go to Sunset Plaza out here in California, and this is the place that you see in the movies. This is all the shishi people sitting around with their chihuahua, drinking coffee and sitting outside in a restaurant. And so I drive by and I go, oh my God, this doesn't look like a rehearsal space. Well, it was his manager's office. And so I brought my stuff in, and to my chagrin, it was just the tiniest little office you ever saw. It was his manager's. And I literally had to push my amplifier around a couch and move a coffee table out of the way to get it in. And then I brought my other stuff, and I basically filled up the whole room, And so I met the Drover brothers, Sean and his brother, and Glenn. And we chatted a little bit, and then Dave showed up, and he sat down with me, and he said, "Okay, well, let's do some songs." So I plugged all my stuff in, and I felt a little overdressed. So I plugged all this stuff in, and I went about to playing Peace Cells, and I looked at Dave, and he kind of looked at me like he's unimpressed, and he goes, "Yeah, that's Peace Cells." I was like, oh, okay. And then I started playing some other song, Holy Wars, started playing that, and he goes, yeah, that's good. And then he goes, play for me that kind of stuff that was on your CD. And I have no idea what it was. I hadn't played that stuff for years. But anyway, I thought, oh, it's all the sound effects and all that. So I just put on my wah-wah and just started getting nuts and just making a racket. And my best junior, Jimi Hendrix, in that little living room. And Dave was like, great, okay, good. Okay, so we start rehearsing on Thursday, and we're going to Dubai in 3 weeks, and you're in. And that was it. That's how I became part of Megadeth back in 2007. The new amps are just fantastic. My arsenal now with Megadeth is 3 of those in each setup. We have an A and a B rig because we tour a lot. So when we tour the States, sometimes our gear has to go overseas, or sometimes it has to go to the other side of the country. And so in order to make those shows, we have to have an identical rig on in either setup. So I've got 3 of those EVO4, ABM EVO4s, which are the 600 watt heads. And 2 of them are running. I use a cabinet on each side of the stage behind our backdrops, the ABM A10s. And 2 of those cabinets, 2 of those EVO 600s are running simultaneously, and I keep a separate volume for each side. One side is behind Kiko, our guitar player, and the other side is behind me. Guess which one's louder? The one behind me is just raging. Dave likes it, but really loud too, come to think of it. Kiko needs to hear himself because he's a very articulate player, and so he doesn't necessarily need to have my stuff in his way, but he does enjoy the sound of it. So on Kiko's side of the stage, if I walk over there, I still have a very polite bass amp kicking away. My settings are interesting because they haven't varied too much over the years, but these amplifiers have that 3rd slider, so it gives you a little more option of really carving in the upper mid-range and the lower mid-range. And I like that a lot because you can really get surgical with it, which helps on a big stage because sometimes that low end will build up, so you might want to pull some of that out or find some kind of bottom somewhere else. I do the same thing I've always done. I'll run you through that in a little bit when I get by the amplifiers, but for the most part, I'll always take the upper mids and the lower treble and really goose those way up high. This way you can really feel the pick hitting the string. almost as if it's a snare drum being hit on the rim. I love that sound. There's a lot of, some of my old favorite bass players have that kind of attack. And especially for the Megadeth stuff, it really helps it cut through two guitars and big drums. So I like to make sure I have that. I like to scoop out just a little bit of the upper low mids, if you follow, around the 200 hertz space, just before it hits that 180 hertz. It seems to be a really good thing to pull some of that down, just to give it a little more air, and so you also get more separation on that treble. I tend to bring the input up pretty hot, until I hear that tube sizzle just a little, and back it down. This way I'll have some headroom. And then finally, what I like to do with these new amps, I've never had this before, so this has been a real boon. I'll take the compressor and I'll move it up pretty significantly, more than I normally would if I was playing with my fingers. I probably wouldn't use as much compression, but since this is mostly with a pick and there's so much attack, on these amps, it works really nicely to crank it up to about the 1 o'clock position. And that keeps the whole amplifier floating, like in one place, which is really killer because you don't have to strike the strings as hard as you want, and you can still get a lot of tonality out of the bass guitar, and it reads through the cabinet very evenly. So I do that. I use my hyperdrive, the Ashdown hyperdrive. I'll usually have that up front, just tickling a little bit of the high mids just to give them a little sizzle too before it hits the amplifier, not too much. And on the in the effects loop, I have an old something called a Maxcom, which you can't get anymore. Sorry, kids. But effectively, what it is it's yet another compressor, and what I use that for is just as a limiting device, just so the amplifier will only go so loud. And I've always done that with transistor amplifiers. It just makes sense. Put an additional limiter on it beyond what's built into it, and then you kind of know exactly when you're starting to get to the top rate of the amp range. So I use one of those, and also in this thing there is what they used to call BBEs, called Sonic Maximizer, which is an active mid-range treble circuit and an active bass boost, and it reads your signal as it comes in and adjusts as it goes. And I use just a little bit of that, and that kind of takes the place of using tweeters inside the cabinet. I can get just a little higher than a 10-inch speaker will speak. And I like that a lot because it gives you a sense of presence that you might get in your bedroom if you're playing, if you know what I'm saying. And the low end it just kind of, when you do that, if you just turn up the low end in that particular device, it'll kind of blend that with the treble. It's kind of useless to do it just one way. So that's what I do. You can also do that with Apex, makes the same sort of thing. You can do it with that as well, if you're interested in that. And other than that, I mean, the amps sound great all by themselves, but with these little enhancements, it just helps me on stage to navigate through the amplifiers, through all the Marshall amplifiers and, all that grit. And I think I've always done that. I've always added a little something forward and back of the amplifier to get it to speak well. One last thing that I like to do that I've started using lately is Darkglass's harmonic booster in front of my ABM amplifiers. The reason I use this is because I used to use the Mark King amplifier that Ashdown made years ago, and they have something in there called the harmonic emphasis. And that, if you turn it up, it kind of gives a brightness to your bass strings that doesn't sound artificial, but kind of sounds like, as they described it, and I concur, kind of sounds like when you just change your strings. You get that little zing on top of the string. So every now and again, depending on how dark the stage is, not light-wise, but sound-wise, and how dense the hall is, I'll have that in place in case I want to add that same sort of thing. And back in the day, if I was just using the Mark King amplifiers, well, built in, but not here at this time. But let's talk to Ashdown about that for the future. After 3 or 4 years in Megadeth, David Ellefson returned, and I, like you, was pretty excited about that because I'd always been a fan of Megadeth anyway. So I'm one of those crazy guys that's like, I want it to be the original band. I always want it to be the original band. It's it's kind of the way I grew up. But in lieu of that, I had to take I had to take the charge of bass spot, when he couldn't be there. So when he came back, I was fine with it. I'd done 2 great albums, United Abomination and Endgame. We'd done 2 world tours, been all over the place. And so at that point, I was kind of excited to maybe try something new, And so I went back home. I started a video production company. I started doing these local jams where all my famous friends would come by and jam with me. It was great. And eventually I ended up in John Fogerty's band. Kenny Aronoff, who I met at a studio session, had called me up one day and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And I said, "Well, I got this jam night. Do you want to come and play with me?" And he goes, "Yeah, jam night?" I said, "Yeah, it's every Tuesday night." And he goes, "It's to help a friend of mine's bar out, but we'll get to jam tunes." I didn't expect him to say yes, but he did. And he was like, "No, I only do weekend gigs these days, so I'll be happy to do that." And I said, "There's not a lot of money." And he goes, "I don't care. I just want to play." So with that, we played for months. And one day, he told me, John Fogerty is changing out his bass player. And so I said, "John Fogerty, he's like one of my heroes from when I was a kid." I said, I love Creedence music. I would love to do that. And Kenny says to me, "Well, he's already been auditioning people, and I told him about you, and, they didn't really respond one way or the other." So I said, "All right, well, thank you for that." The next week, he goes, "Well, we looked at some other guys, and, I told John, before you choose that guy, my friend James I told you about, he plays like that, only he's got a little bit more, So they had me down, and sure enough, I showed up, and I was off to the races with John. John loved me. John also loved my Ashdown amplifier, by the way, and I don't say that sparingly. He's a gear hound. I'm a bit of a gear hound, too. He loved stuff. As soon as I brought my amplifier in, he'd beeline to it, and he just looked at it, and he'd never seen one before, so he was really into it. But more importantly, he loved my sound. After we played, he goes, "This is great." Yeah, he goes, "I don't know how you do it, but this is a sound I love." So went on with that for the next 9. How do I end up back in Megadeth? It's like that Godfather movie, just when I thought I got out, they pulled me back in again. But no, anyway, when they needed a bass player, it became apparent. I thought to myself, they'll probably call me up. But I also thought to myself, it's been a while since I've played that kind of music, so maybe it'll be great, but it'll be all right, maybe not. Sure enough, the phone rings, and Dave is like, we've got to do this metal tour of the year, James. I know you're the guy who can do it. I would love to have you here. If you would just commit to just doing this tour, that would be great. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. Doesn't he want me to rejoin the band? But then I thought about it. He knew I had another band, and he was telling me, he goes, "I don't want you to screw up whatever you got going." And, I was being loyal to John. So we went out on the tour, and gosh, it was just the best time. I was so enamored with the band that he had put together with Kiko and with Dirk, that I was blown away. And Dave, he's just delivering the goods every day. The great thing about Dave is, he's been through a lot. He recovered from cancer. He's had problems with his back. Just over the years, he's had more things than most professional wrestlers would have, and he shows no sign of it. I mean, he just gets up there and plays and just gives it his all. So after that tour, I was sitting there going, man, I think I might like to stay here for a while. And so luckily, as luck would have it, not too long after that, Dave calls me up at home and he goes, we would love to have you be part of the band officially if you want to stay. And I thought, that's exactly what I was thinking, man. Let's do it. So anyway, back in Megadeth, back out on the road. Newest album, The Sick, The Dying, and The Dead. We have been touring that one. We just started this year, and we show no signs of stopping. We're coming to you, kids.
The quiet war.
ever. This is generally what I would set up for a Megadeth or a heavy metal type of sound. As you can see, the input control is at about 2 o'clock. That's usually right for most pickups. I've always got the tube mix control up to about 1 or 2 o'clock. Somewhere in there usually sings pretty good. I have it in the flat position, which takes the smiley face part of it away. And let's go through the EQ really quick. Bass is up significantly because I take this 180 hertz and drop it about halfway down from its middle point. The 240 hertz slider is just a notch down from where it normally is. I do it by ear. I'll just hit the string and I'll just see how that sounds, and then I'll move it. Mid-range can float between here and there. It depends on what the cabinet sounds like and how loud you're playing and how much mid-range you really want. So depending on if you're using a pick or your fingers, you can move that around and really find a good spot. The upper mid-range and treble, I always go nuts on that. That's my favorite sound on the Ashdown AVMs. Just cranking that to the bejesus. And the 1.3K gives that extra bit of push on the higher mid-range. So for Washington is next. This is pretty much the sound I went for. I've got a compressor and my hyperdrive on top, and I'll show you those in a second, and they have a presetting on them before they even get to that spot. Okay, for the Gibson bass, playing on Symphony of Destruction, the setting changes just a little bit. I move that up just a tad, just to heat up that tube a little bit. The pickups don't quite have as much output as my Yamaha does. Everything else stays the same except the treble. I just go nuts on that. I'll move it all the way up to about 9 o'clock. Okay, so moving from the preamp, let's look at the hyperdrive. The hyperdrive settings are actually pretty docile. Got the input set so that the meter registers really nicely. You can see the frequency's pretty far up there. That's probably just over 1, closer to 2K. The Q control is set for narrow. The drive control is set to about 3 o'clock, which is a lot of drive, and the 10 dB boost is up as well. And then the real trick is just really bringing that mix way down. And you can see that's at about the 2 o'clock mark. And then setting the output so it sounds about the same as when it's not on, as far as the amount of volume the preamp sees. Then if we come over here, I've got this Cali 76, which I like to just kind of buffer out some of the bumps in the frequency range. You can see the way it's set. It has a low ratio. I'm really leaning on the dry setting, which is the non-compressed setting. That's the first knob at 2 o'clock. The output is set so it sounds the same as whether it's on or off. The input is set just so it actuates the compressor when I need it. And the attack is relatively fast with a slow release. And the high-pass filter is way up there, probably around 500 to, about 500 hertz, I imagine that's